Fiddlin Ray, and I'm here visiting my old friend Joe Golden at Westmoreland String Workshop. So I guess we could just roll it back and let him insert that what he was just talking about here. But yeah, Joe, how long have you been doing this?
I started in, I would say like right around 2000 in Brunswick, Maine. So I worked up there, sort of by chance got into repairs. I was teaching in a shop there, and the guy was like, hey, a repair tech just left. Would you be interested in doing some work? And at the time, I was just kind of doing my own setups and stuff like that. So he kind of opened the door, and it's kind of an embarrassing story because he was like our old repair guy. I have his name. I think I told you this story.
Whoa.
Yeah, so he was like, you might want to call our old repair guy. So I did call the old repair. The old repair guy was Dana Bourgeois, which
Wow.
is a famous.
Yeah.
I had no idea. He just wrote down Dana and gave me the number. Who was also living. He said, I think he lives in Brunswick here. He was actually my neighbor. I didn't know that. I didn't know I was speaking to Dana Bourgeois. So it was very embarrassing that I was talking to him about repairs. And he was like, I'm Dana Bourgeois, and I think my jaw hit the floor. He's a famous guitar player.
Yeah.
So I got to know Dana, and I got to know some of his repair guys, and so that's kind of, not so much involved with Dana, but a lot of his repair guys that went off and did their own business. So there was a music store up there called Buck Dancers. So it was like that kind of approach. And then Mike Rose was a builder. He was a repair guy builder. He was moving to Florida. He was selling his shop. So I drove up to up the coast of Maine, and I bought his repair shop. And that's where a lot of the tools came from.
That's awesome.
So then about 2004-ish, 5-ish, I came back to Pennsylvania. And I think that this is like shop number 3 or 4 different versions of a repair shop. So this shop has been since 2011.
That seems about right. Yeah, we were just talking, I think, before she started rolling, but this is the second shop I've worked with you. And first shop, 2006, 2007, I was shorter and I had a lot more hair. But yeah, I've been using Joe almost exclusively since then, and always been more than happy with it. So I'm really excited to actually get down and sit down and talk to you about like the do's and don'ts of instrument care. So I mean, I think the first thing on the list, I mean, I know as a teacher, just the last 2 weeks, I've spent the first half of everyone's lesson just trying to tune the fiddle, track down buzzes, and the big thing you get a lot is humidity this time of year. So can you tell us about that and why it's important for us to be aware of that?
Yeah, so, and I would try to keep this as simple as possible. So humidity is really just moisture in the air. And so your wooden instruments, mandolins, violins, guitars, have moisture in them, and they need moisture just like we need moisture, and we need to keep hydrated. So when we start talking about the humidity levels, what we're talking about is something that affects the playability, because once you start drying up the wood, the water, the playability of the instrument the instrument may sound harsh, it may not be easy to play. On a guitar, it's really easy. So on a guitar, I have a guitar neck here. You can start to feel the fret ends. So the actual wood is shrinking, and so then you can feel the fret ends because they're metal and they're not going to shrink. So that's a sign, that your guitar is getting dry.
Yeah. So like I said, in like the fiddle world, we kind of experience the same thing as that wood contracts, it contracts to itself, right? So your peg holes go, and your pegs go, and sometimes they won't grip again for a long time.
So why that happens is because ebony, which is what pegs are made out of, that's a very dense and kind of like it has like an oil to it. So it's not the maple, which is what your scroll is made out of, will shrink. And so the shrinking of the maple and the ebony kind of staying the same, you start to find tuning issues.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think I agree. I can definitely tell by the sound of things. I start to just associate that sound now. It's like, yeah, that sounds dry. A good sign is if you have a fiddle that you like and you don't think it sounds very good, and you go out and you buy an $80 set of strings and you put on it and it still doesn't sound good. That could be a sign. Humidity, especially in the wintertime. Forced air heating, your environment does kind of affect that. My last apartment I lived in, it had like these big cast iron, it was a boiler with these big cast iron radiators, and humidity was never a problem in that spot because there was no circulation of air happening.
Yeah. So you with that, if you imagine a cup of tea that's sitting in a room that's hot, that tea kind of just like the temperature of the tea just is kind of there, and it'll warm that area. It's not a blast of air. So any type of forced air makes a huge impact because you're throwing a lot of heat, a lot of dryness right at the instrument. That's why I always ask about the heating source in a house. What's really bad is wood burners. And so wood burners are just an amount of really dry heat that is thrown at an instrument, and the instrument it can't handle that kind of dryness all at once. So, I get a lot of instruments in here because of moisture related or dryness, and so this time of the year. So on a guitar, what happens is the bridge will pop off or the frets will get really sharp. On violins, it's much smaller, and so what happens to violins is you get like top cracks, and this is an example. We have a top crack that has come in here because the instrument has shrunk down, and the top actually drops, and you start to get some cracks. So in this particular case, I had to take the table or the top off so I can cleat this and kind of clean this up.
Mandolin with a similar issue there, crack. As the wood contracts, it pulls apart from each other, right?
So all of this, and all of this is preventable, and so that's why we're here. The preventability of this is there. So the first thing you have to invest in is a hygrometer. And a hygrometer, you can purchase those online. They're not that expensive. Some violin cases come with meters already built in. I would stay away from those simply because they're not very accurate. I had a case in here yesterday. I opened it up. It said 78%. It was not 78%. So ideal is 50% humidity. So there's a sort of a giving and taking. So 40 to 60 is the range. 50% is ideal. 70 degrees is ideal. So those are the ideal numbers. Below 40, things start to happen that can be concerning. When you get into the teens, that's when things get even worse. The instrument will split, slipping of pegs, all kinds of different things. But the ideal number is 50%, and you have to do that. You can't just sense it. You have to have a meter.
Right.
Now, hygrometer, you can spend $20. You can spend $100. Just to give yourself a ballpark of the reading of the room, and that's going to be super important because crack repairs are expensive. So you're going to save in the long run. Absolutely. And your instruments are going to sound better.
That's absolutely true. Yeah. I'm a big believer of having at least two, one in your room and one in the case.
Yes.
Because, humidity in your room might be fine, humidity in the case might not be, and vice versa.
And that brings another point that I get. This week I probably had 3 or 4 calls on what do I do? Do I keep it in the case? Do I have it out? And my answer to that is you have to have a meter to read. If you're out of the case and your room is 17%, then at night, yes, you have to keep it in the case. You have to keep it hydrated. If your room is not that bad, then you can treat the room so you can have your instruments out.
Sure.
So it all comes back to the meter. Like you can't. That's what I really don't understand is that instructors like yourself are talking more and more about this, because it is really super important, and we are having a really true winter. So we're experiencing some really lows in the humidity levels.
Yeah, and I think if you so for me, I remember one time when I first learned this lesson the hard way. I was still a kid. I was in here with my mandolin. It was buzzing. My pegs weren't holding, and I had my guitar in here. The bridge popped up, like you said, and I mean that guitar was actually in here for a couple months, because for you to actually do that repair, to put it back together, you have to wait for the wet wood to take on the moisture back out of the air and return to its original size.
Yeah. So in extreme cases, you have to really inject some moisture into it. And this year so far, I think people and companies are doing a better job of getting products out to help with that. But again, it comes back to the reader. In this shop right now, I'm about 40%, which is on the low end. But if I did a repair, if I had this shop at 50% and I re-glued your acoustic bridge, and you walk out of here and you go to your 17%, that bridge is going to pop
that
again.
Disparity.
So I have to kind of live in this world of a low humidity. Now where I keep my instruments is higher. It's in the 50% range. And I see you brought one example.
One of these packets, which, this is it's sold by Diodario Boveda? I might be getting that name wrong, but you can get these in cigar shops.
Yeah.
Get them online in big packs, but if you're in a pinch, be like, I really want one today, go find your local tobacco store, and they'll have them. But no, I mean, these are really great, because I remember thinking, it's like, well, I have a room humidifier, but at that time, like, basically the answer was you just put like a pill bottle with drill some holes in it and put a sponge in it, and I was like, but Joe, I'm doing all the things, and you said, it's not enough.
Yeah. So that's the old timey kind of way of thinking about it, is drilling a hole in a bottle and putting a sponge. That's not going to get you where you need to.
Well, yeah, and I mean, because the problem with that is the last thing you really want in your case is a container of water, right? So you have to squeeze all the water out of the sponge, and that kind of defeats the purpose.
Yeah.
So when we were doing that, I had like 7 or 8 instruments, and I was doing that every 2 or 3 days, and it was a chore, and eventually you get busy and you forget, and then
yeah, it's sort of like having a baby, in the sense of you really have to take care of it in that regard. And so so the idea there is either you treat the room or you keep it in the case. If you're treating the room, you need to have multiple readers around the room so you can get an idea, because where where your humidifier is might be one level, but across the room where your guitars are sitting might be something very low. So having a meter is, again, I keep on going back to that. So my music teacher told me when I was learning, you needed a mirror, a metronome, and a music stand. Those were the 3 M's, and that's what was that. But as a repair guy, I need to and in my music room, if you would go in through, I have a mirror because you have to watch your technique. I have a music stand because you got to have the right postures, and you have to have a metronome to have your timing. So those 3 things are super important. But there's also multiple readers in there. I have multiple humidifiers going as well, and it's healthier for you. I mean, it's healthier for the humans as well. So I'm giving you some examples of what can happen. And as a repair guy, it's not necessarily fun to do structural humidity related repairs, because they're often cracks, and so cracks that you can't make them necessarily go away. So you have to kind of like do your best and
right. I mean, it's like anything with wood is, cut once, measure twice for a reason, right?
Yeah, it's one of those things that, it's like a scar that can go on an instrument, and it can also, if you have a very expensive instrument, it can affect the value of your instrument. Oh. So a lot of times people are playing very old violins, and it amazes me that those that were underneath grandma's bed for 50, 60 years don't have any top or back cracks. Right. But it's I think.
But a lot of them do too, I'm sure.
Yeah, and it really comes down to how well those instruments made and the cuts of the spruce and so forth on the top. Anyway, but repair work in the humidity related are not fun.
Right. Well, yeah, and I'm just seeing in the comment section, right, like that one guy that's always like, well, I just kept my mandolin in the back of my car for 3 years, and I probably only had to tune it like 2 or 3 times. But for the rest of us that can't really repel the laws of nature, right?
Yeah.
We have you can have some expensive instruments in even more expensive homes, and they're pulling apart. So this is a really good conversation to have. How do you go about treating a room for humidity?
Treating a room is I always find if you're going to treat a room, I think you have to be realistic on how big the room is. So that's the first thing, is it's just looking at the size of the room, because I'll never forget, like it was probably 3 years ago, I did a back crack on a guitar. It was a Taylor guitar, and it came together. I put it in humidity. I actually had to bag the instrument and then put it in humidity, sealing the sound hole with a sponge in it, with a bag. Like, these are the extreme. This is when it's very extreme, and the instrument's on the verge of like sort of self-destructing. I gave that instrument back to the guy, and within 3 weeks, that back crack opened back up again, and he messaged me, and he was upset with that it happened again, and he sent me a photo of his room, his music room, and it was ginormous. And then on the desk, he had this little puff of air, this little desktop humidifier that was puffing out a little thing of moisture, and I was like, oh my goodness, like that's not even close to. I mean, if the wind blew, the moisture, it's just an old house, and so I think treating the room, if you have a large room, then you have to have a humidifier that's going to get there. They make humidifiers with built-in hygrometers, and that's really nice, because when the level gets low, it kicks on, and that's what you're hearing in my shop right now. That's the humidifier running. It's going down to I think to 38.2 or something, and then it kicks back on to get me back to 42. So if you're treating the room, you have to be realistic. You can't have this little Vicks vaporizer just kicking in the corner, and you have to have meters, multiple meters, and be if you have a closet. I've had conversations about this. If you have a closet smaller and you want to have maybe your guitars out, or maybe hang your violin in there, you can treat your closet, which is a much smaller space. And that way you're not trying to heat this ginormous room. Mm-hmm. So treating the room is a little bit trickier in older houses. Treating a room also has a lot to do with how the air, if it's forced air, hot water heats much better. So, treating the room comes down to the meter. Multiple meters.
Always, that seems to be the theme, right? Comes down to that.
You're going to hear that over. Yeah. Well, as a repair guy, they'll say, I get this a lot. I have 14 guitars, but this guitar keeps on cracking. How is that? There's something wrong with this guitar. And we're talking about wood. The species of wood varies from certain instruments will be impacted by low humidity, others won't. So you can't compare instruments and say, really that cracked, this didn't, why did that crack, why didn't this crack? It's a species of wood.
Yeah. I mean, I guess you could kind of compare that to, it's like If you have, if you're cooking and you have multiple slabs of meat, right? You want to measure the temperature of the, the
Exactly.
biggest piece of meat, right? Where with our instruments, it's like, okay, well, this is my most delicate thing. I
Yes.
need to humidify to its standard, and then the rest will be fine.
Yeah, and going with that point, it's like when somebody wants to collect acoustic or or collect violins, it creates a lot of anxiety within me just hearing that, because you have to be very vigilant. You have to be
Right.
aware, and you have to invest in humidification. You have to invest in meters. You have to, and if you do that, you can keep them safe. It's different when you're talking about a solid body guitar.
Yeah, I mean, for someone that has definitely lost the room, the treatment battle, and again, had a friend of mine, and they had again, like, it's like a big lofty, room that she keeps her basses in, and she's got like 3 humidifiers going all day, full blast, putting 25 gallons of water, each, and the humidity in their apartment's 20%. It's like, well, to me, my big thing is it's always been the case. Try to treat the room because that's what the instrument comes out of into, but ultimately, it should probably go back into a good case.
Yeah.
Which kind of sucks sometimes because we had one here a minute ago, but like sometimes you get like these really cool like vintage coffin cases, with like an air gap about that big when the lid shuts. Or I have one here. It's just like a soft case. But really, for me, like the game changer of keeping stuff away is something like this. So this is made by a company named Robolock. I'm not sponsored by them or anything. It's just I've been using it, but it's basically anything like a fiberglass case, and there's a rubber seal here. So the air in the case is the air in the case. And yeah, like these things are great,
They
because
really are.
they'll
They
expend the moisture if it needs it, but if it exceeds that percent, then it actually starts to bring it back in.
And I think where the hang up is that whenever you're investing, it's not in it, some of this stuff can be expensive. And
Sure.
when you're buying stuff that really does, like, you can't see the value of it necessarily. You can't visually see that my instrument is benefiting from this. But I assure you that your instrument, I mean, back in the 20s and 30s, there's stories of like all the classical violinists would only record in the summer months because their instruments sounded so big and so full. Now, you can't talk on the other end of this spectrum and say, well, what if my instrument gets too wet? That's the other thing, too.
I was going to get to that, yeah.
But this is super important because people hear me talk about humidity over and over again, and they'll call me in August, and they're like, you know what, I'm still putting the humidity, and I'm like, no, that's not how this works. So, one of the guys that I worked on always said, when your furnace kicks on, you need to start thinking about humidity, and I've always kept that sort of phrase in my head. So when your humidity, when you need to check it, is when your furnace starts to kick off. When your furnace isn't running anymore and you don't need to heat your house, then there's probably a really good chance you don't need humidity. And then the opposite of like, do I need to dehumidify? And so that question comes up a lot too, and that depends. Again, you're going with if you have questions about this, get a meter, and then you'll see that, okay, I'm at 70% right now. My instrument's like sort of saturated. So now what do I need to do? And that's where the
What are the side effects of that saturation you're talking about?
The saturation, sometimes some warping can happen. Sometimes instruments can sound dull. It's almost like they're, not that they're waterlogged, but they have too much humidification. So there's things that can happen there that, it's much easier to talk about when an instrument's really dry, because there's a lot of visual things. When an instrument's wet, it's just kind of maybe swollen. Your action on an acoustic might be really high because you're taking your the belly of your guitar and it's coming up. So a violin, things could be, you can notice that your string height is really higher.
Yeah.
So playability can get a little funkier.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's about it. Get a good case. Obviously, be smart with your budget. But if you have a $1,000+ instrument, or an instrument that I remember I had a friend. I have patches.
Yeah.
Right? I have a pretty old fiddle. The label says 1800, and it's just like, okay, well, now this is your responsibility to this makes it at least another 60 years, right? You can look at it that way. It's like $100 case, $200 case. You can obviously spend a lot more than that on a case, but get the best kind of case that you can afford. It's not gonna hurt.
Yeah, and that's just to end on that thought. We are just the kind of keepers of many of these instruments. Like, I just sold a violin that was from the 1700s. Like, these are going to outlast us, and like, we have to have some sort of responsibility to kind of make sure that they go to the next generation, because the wood selections, how the instruments are made, I mean, it's just so unique and so powerful, and you can't just replicate that. So it is important for us to think about these things, and it does blow my mind to have conversations with people and they're not quite on board or want to invest, less than $50 on meters. And
what are you talking about? I got the original,
exactly.
1800s coffin case.
Yeah, exactly. But that's a really good point that you made. So
yeah, when somebody brings in an instrument, like how do you go about that inspection? Do you have like a 4-point check that you do?
Well, I think what happens is, I think that they have to hear my spiel. Like, they have to hear my me talk about humidity, and I try not to make them feel bad if it's humidity related. But sometimes they don't want to say, yeah, that's humidity, and I appreciate when they come in and be like, yeah, it's in a dry place. I did this, and I'm like, all right, well, lesson learned,
right?
But when an instrument comes in here, the first thing is just the evaluation, and that is done with the customer. And so then we get an idea of what the instrument needs, what needs to happen, as opposed to sometimes they're like, well, I'd like to get, on a guitar, like, I'd like to get fret work. And it's like, is it something that you need right now? Because, so we put like must-dos, and then, hey, maybe I'll do that down the line. So I like to provide an estimate, and so I want to walk through that process with them.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, on that note, this is kind of like a public service announcement from like the not repairmen, because I get a lot of students that, or I just know people that they start, and maybe they're like hardwood floor guys, or like they're really good, like they build furniture and stuff. It's a really bad idea to try to work on one of these if you've not learned how to do that, even if you are like a crafty, because like all of the stuff that we're talking about, we're talking about instruments, so we don't really think about words like machine or tool. Mm-hmm. But they are like very intricately made to be put together a certain way, and therefore be taken apart a certain way. And I know I've been in here with you, hair's all frazzled because somebody just thought they would just wood glue something back together, or right. I've seen guys take like, oh, well, the neck on my bass started popping off, so I just put a lag bolt and just and you might be able to come up with a repair for that, but when you have a repair further on down the line, it might cost twice as much, because it's going to take you twice as much to work around that, right. If you even can.
In the repair world, that's called fixing the fix. And I spend a lot of times, like even an instrument like this top, somebody glued, and the actual glue job on this is what's holding me up. So then you have to go in and clean that, and they didn't glue it right, they didn't cleat it, there wasn't, so fixing the fix is really, so I see that a lot with neck breaks, like a guitar neck break happens, and they're like, somebody in the family has, I have one over there. It's either glue or they get the drill gun out. And those things are getting fixed. Like, back in the day, neck breaks used to be something of like, well, the guitar's done, and it's not necessarily the case. So there's a lot of science that has changed in the repair world with neck breaks, and you can do a lot with them now that you couldn't in the past. So, like, that's where I get frustrated, and it's just for the owner, because they might have loved the guitar or might have loved the violin. You can still work with it. It's just there's techniques that we have,
right.
And so
and it was kind of the pre-roll, but you were talking about apprenticing, and the thing about like any sort of trade is trades that do apprenticeships, there's usually a reason for that. People don't usually apprentice in things if you don't have to. Well, you just hop up on YouTube and DIY neck graft.
That's a really. You mentioned something like there's repairing is there's some guys that build furniture that are very crafted that have maybe made cabinets or something like that. The techniques that are used here are very different, and so the approaches are very different. So that goes back to the point of like when you have an instrument and it's made out of wood, typically it can be fixed. It's just how much the balance of like, is the repair outvaluing
the instrument,
and that's where it gets kind of tricky. So I always say an instrument can have sentimental value. It can have actually vintage or value there. So when they have both of those things, it's an easy decision to make. When it has just sentimental value, it becomes a little bit trickier. You have to decide what you want to spend on it. And when it has neither of those things, then you're like, okay, hang it on the wall. Because I get it. Not, it may not be saved at this time, but it can be saved at some other time.
So to all of you do-it-yourself guys and gals out there, at least give Joe a call.
Maybe not approach it with super glue. Like for some reason, the DIY guys are always like, I got super glue. I got some CA glue.
Got some Gorilla Tape.
So no, there's not a bottle of Gorilla Glue in this shop. Yeah, that's a no. But I get a lot of like, well, I put some super glue, and I'm like, oh no, so it happens.
So all of that stuff aside, like, what's the number one don't do this to an instrument that you've seen regularly?
I think the number one thing that I see is probably it being left in a vehicle, whether it's too cold or whether it's too hot. An instrument doesn't necessarily do well in that kind of cooker in the summertime. Your instrument's made out of glue, so the reversing of the glue, the loosening of the glue can create all kinds of problems. And the other thing that I see a lot too is on acoustic guitars, like the strap button. Definitely call me. Don't that's it. You think that would be an easy repair, but I see a lot of like cracked heels and slipping of bits, or putting the strap button on the wrong side of the I know wrong side of the heel.
Oops,
and so those kind of things, like, you think, well, I can do that. Those things can go wrong really fast.
Yeah, well, that's kind of back to our last subject is, it doesn't matter. Like, it's no disrespect to anybody. It's like, oh, I'm crafty. I do all kinds of things. It's like, but this is a machine or a tool, and It's like if you take apart an engine or a motor, you really should know how that works, because if the timing of that doesn't all line back up again, you're going to have scrap. Or again, make yourself more complicated. What is like the number one, please do this, humidity aside, because I think we've covered that.
Well, yeah, okay, so outside of the humidity realm, I would say the number one thing that I would do is wipe down your strings. So we have oils, we have, different things in our hands, and violin strings are not cheap. And so probably 80-90% of the strings that sort of break or come apart are due to the oils. So if you have a microfiber or some sort of cloth like that in your case, just wipe down your strings and you will get, it's amazing how much more life you will get out of it. And you have to change your strings. Like, that's the other thing that people are like, I haven't changed. They're proud of the fact that they haven't changed their string in 2 years. But as a string, to get it to pitch with all of the gunk and funk that one has in their hands, it takes a little bit more tension. So it's putting more tension to get up to pitch. So it's actually not so healthy for the instrument.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I know just like you won't ever really get it in tune. They're so much harder to get in tune. Not even in tune like while you're tuning it, but on like a fretless instrument.
Yeah.
You could have a note that the tune will read as good, but it just doesn't. There's just something.
Yeah.
You lose all of your overtones when you let them die. Yeah, that's a really great point. Joe, do you have people ship work to you?
I do. I have people that ship guitars, banjos, violins. I will do that work. I just think that there's enough work in the area. I try to cater to the local musicians, and I try to.
You do an excellent job.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate you saying that. I do. I mean, I think that an instrument. It's what's amazing about this profession is that an instrument is just not a box of wood. It's a companion. It's somebody. It's almost like someone's best friend. I had just had a guy describe the guitar to him. He's like, man, that's been like my best friend. And I chuckled at that, but I understand what he's saying. It's something that we that each day brings us a different type of joy. So, I try to cater more to the, and sometimes when people are shipping, like
anytime that you ship, there's a margin of risk.
There's a margin of risk, and
but,
it's really expensive now. So it's like, you're factoring hundreds of dollars in just to get to the instrument to and fro. So it's like, ugh, that's a lot.
It is. But I asked just because I have worked with some people. I do, remote lessons, and the reasons why they're taking remote lessons from me is they live in very remote places, and they don't have access.
And I get that. Like I had a conversation with someone that was very remote, and they weren't able to drive, and so that was like maybe 2 weeks ago, and I did the repair and then sent it back. So it does happen, and I'm happy to do it.
Okay. How can people find Westmoreland String Workshop?
I have a website. Instagram, it's just Westmoreland String Workshop, and that's probably where I get most of my. And then I'm on Facebook, which is Westmoreland String Workshop, and I have a website. So all of my contact information is there.
Excellent. Well, if you're in the area, or if you're not in the area and you need somebody, I can't recommend my friend Joe anymore.
Thanks, man.
Thanks.
I appreciate it.